Okay, so next, I'll give a little bit of a preview here of today's COVID update. Kip and Andrew will provide an update on our move from stage 8 or tier 3. We'll also have an EOC update from Kip, and I just want to acknowledge a couple of things. The memo from Councilmember Perales on al fresco. We'll be looping back on that issue. Also today received a joint letter from the Downtown Association and the SVO requesting expansion of al fresco from 10 o'clock to midnight. So we will be looking at those items and looping back on them. And then also today, we have the city services update. And so this is really a continuation of the discussion from a few weeks ago. And as we recognized at that meeting a few weeks ago, it's critical that we keep you all and our residents informed on the status of our city services, which ones are currently operating, which ones are not, and the plan to get those that aren't up and running again. We're certainly open to feedback, recognizing that we need your support, and hopefully today's presentation positions us well to be able to communicate our status as a city in terms of providing services. And then finally, we will do a reflection of some of the artwork that's been done through COVID. I think that's it's important that we see some of the emotions and feelings being felt by our community during this time. And so I'm going to pass it off to Kip to begin the formal presentation.
Thank you, Dave. Good afternoon, Mayor, City Council, and members of the public. Kip Harkness, Deputy City Manager and Director of the Emergency Operations Center. On behalf of all the employees in the Emergency Operations Center and across the city who've been responding to COVID-19, I want to take a few minutes to update you on our response over the last month. It's now 269 days since we initiated our pandemic response team here in the city. In the United States, we have seen some 220,000 deaths, including an all too painful 378 deaths locally, with 87 patients struggling with COVID-19 in local hospitals, continued high unemployment, economic distress, all of which disproportionately impact our Black, Latinx, and Native American individuals and communities across the nation and here in San Jose. Today, you'll hear about updates on the public health orders, which are quite significant, an update on our work in the EOC very briefly, and a deep dive into city services, where we are and where we are in the resumption of those services. And finally, as Dave mentioned, some of the art from local San Jose artists in a project called Holding the Moment, reflecting on COVID-19. To start us out, I'll turn it over to Andrew Eric, our Deputy EOC Director, to discuss in detail the recent changes to the public health orders. Andrew?
Thanks, Kip. Good afternoon, Mayor, City Council, members of the public. Andrew Eric, Deputy Director of the EOC. California continues to structure its COVID-19 public health restrictions for each county according to the blueprint for a safe economy. Since the last time we reported to Council on COVID-19, the state has actually updated metrics for the blueprint, specifically to include a health equity metric. This metric was added due to the clear fact that certain communities, among them low income, Latino, Black, Pacific Islander, Vietnamese, and essential workers, have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19, as Kip just mentioned, and that those disparities create a public health imperative to address COVID-19 exposure and spread in those communities. The new health equity metric released by the state requires that in order to advance to the next less restrictive tier, a county must meet not only the original case rate and positivity rate metrics, but also a test positivity metric in specifically those census tracts that fall within the lowest quartile of the Healthy Places Index. Counties must also demonstrate targeted investment strategies to eliminate disparities in levels of transmission in those disproportionately affected census tracts. Within this new blueprint for a safe economy, Santa Clara County as of last week, met all the criteria, including the health equity metric, to move to tier 3, which indicates that there is a continued moderate risk level of COVID-19 in our county, but does allow the opening of a demonstrably wider range of businesses than was possible during the full shelter in place. As a result, and as a result of the fact that the city has synced up our pandemic recovery plan to match the state's blueprint, we are as a city now officially in stage 8, which in our plan enables substantial reopening, which you'll hear further about later in this presentation, but we are still not at tier 4 or stage 9, which would allow a full or near full reopening. This slide provides a summary of changes now that the county and therefore the city is now in tier 3. The major differences of tier 3 compared to previous tier 2 restrictions are that indoor pools may now open, indoor movie theaters may now operate at limited capacity, indoor worship services are now allowed at limited capacity, indoor dining operations and wineries may now operate, but at limited capacity. Bars, brew pubs, and breweries that do not serve food may now operate outdoors. Family entertainment centers can operate indoors at limited capacity, as can card rooms, indoor shopping malls, and other retail businesses, as well as gyms and fitness centers and museums and zoos. It's important to note that for some of these sectors and businesses, county guidelines are stricter than the state guidelines. And as the county reminds us regularly, the stricter of any restrictions apply. So we encourage all members of the public to follow the guidelines put out by the county, which encompass both the county guidelines and the state guidelines. In addition to guidelines for specific sectors, the county also has general guidelines for all businesses, and these are important for the city in 2 ways. First, our Emergency Operations Center and Office of Economic Development are engaged in consistent and widespread outreach efforts to make sure businesses are informed of the guidelines and are submitting updated social distancing protocols when required. And second, as a city, we structure our understanding of what is safe based largely on the framework laid out by the state and the county. And as we take steps to reopen our city, we are following those guidelines, including encouraging telework wherever possible, and only when it is essential, deeming that a service must be provided in person. There are many other considerations to keep in mind when we think about reopening our city, and you'll hear much more about those items later in this item. But for now, I'll pass it back to Kip Harkness for the overall EOC update.
Thank you, Andrew. As Andrew shared, our county has shown enough progress to be able to partially and cautiously relax some restrictions. It's notable in listening to these updates that the process of opening back up is much more complex than the act of going into shelter in place back in March. As Dr. Saracoti has said, it is only going to get harder. Previously, we've discussed with City Council and the public what we viewed as the 3 challenges of now: the public health challenge, the economic challenge, and the resulting fiscal challenge that we're facing due to COVID-19. At this point, it's clear that there are in fact at least 5 complex and interrelated challenges we find ourselves facing all at once. Challenge 4 is addressing systemic racism and advancing equity by reimagining how we serve the community to reverse patterns of systemic racism and create an equitable valley of opportunity for all. This has always been with us, but is laid bare and made more visible by this pandemic. Challenge 5 is how do we respond to environmental conditions that have been exacerbated by climate change, like wildfires, power shutoffs that affect our city, and how do we create a sustainable model to respond to these acute threats and hazards while continuing to provide our prolonged response to COVID-19. Taken together, these 5 challenges now create the most complex and difficult environment that most of us have worked in. So as we move forward, it's important that we ground ourselves in first principles. And for the emergency response and within the Emergency Operations Center, we have embodied or strive to embody 3 principles: be compassion in action, put the community and the people at the center of what we do, be open, candid, and direct. Don't be afraid to speak the truth, be honest about what doesn't work, and then act as one team. Even if there's friction, even if there's tension, even if we don't always agree, work as a single team to try to be compassion in action. So with these principles as our guide, our Emergency Operations Center has continued to work to slow and reduce the spread of COVID-19 and support our most at-risk population. I want to give us a couple of quick highlights before we dive into city services. So over the past month, since our last COVID-19 update to City Council, we have, led by our nonprofit and community partners, coordinated the distribution of approximately 9 million meals countywide with no reported significant gaps. During item 3.5, you'll hear in more detail about the evolution and transition of some of our food distribution work and the details about how we will continue to address food insecurity and support the county in their leadership countywide. The Emergency Interim Housing Branch has continued to work on 3 separate sites. The Monterey-Burnell site is fully open and operational with 55 residents and a total of 78 beds and wraparound services and support. Brew Ferrari and Evans Lane sites are scheduled to come online within the next month and will add space for an additional 120 families. The city's nonprofit Coronavirus Relief Fund grant program application closed last Thursday. We received a total of 119 grant applications asking for assistance. We'll be focusing funding on the most vulnerable zip codes and populations and the following program areas: outreach, education, empowerment around the pandemic, case management, mental health and health services, legal assistance and childcare, distance learning, and youth programming. Our Coronavirus Relief Fund rental relief program is actually also now underway and operational, with Sacred Heart Community Services and Catholic Charities taking the lead on administering those and screening and supporting some of our most vulnerable residents in their time of need. Our Emergency Public Information Officers, our EPIO, have continued to promote information on a wide variety of events and services, including our power shutoffs, our final push for the census, the changing public health orders that Andrew just spoke about, the Flex Alert messaging on injury conservation, and information on cooling centers and hours. Last, but certainly not least, our census outreach campaign has made significant progress. Back in May, we had the 7th highest response rate out of 89 cities with more than 250,000 people in the United States. At the end of last week, we were up to number 2 with the 2nd best response rate out of those 89 cities. Moreover, our extensive outreach efforts led by Mario Maciel and others and his very stalwart crew working through literally smoke and orange skies were able to reach some of the hardest areas of our city and doubled the amount of progress in the hard to reach census tracts, ensuring that the places and the people that most need to be counted were. So for today, our deep dive, as we said, is around city services, and joining me for this is Kelly Parmalee, who is both our Assistant Director of Human Resources and in our EOC structure is our Director of our Task Force Powered by People 2.0. I want to give a little bit of framing and then allow Kelly to walk you through in some fair detail a lot of data and insights around where we are and aren't with city services. Top level, what you see is what we're beginning to do, and we'll be coming back to you iteratively in November and December and forward, is really balance a set of competing priorities. Before COVID, we had 22 council policy priorities that we had begun work on. We were beginning to work internally on a roadmap to prioritize about 68 initiatives of change and progress within the city that we had been asked to work on. And then COVID hit, with at least 13 major new services and initiatives, plus the entire operations of the emergency response. On top of that, what we normally think of as business as usual is about 264 city services that we provide day in, day out, 24/7, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. Those services we often don't think about. They are core to making sure that people can shelter in place. And as we got into COVID, we realized there's sort of 3 main things that shifted this. One, all of our work became more complex. It's just simply harder to do to make sure that that work is done safely. 2, new things were added. Those initiatives like feeding people, we went from feeding about 875 seniors a week to coordinating 2.5 million meals a week. And the fact is we were doing it with fewer people, both because we had pulled people into the EOC and EOC leadership, and also because we had frozen many of our city positions to enable us to have some fiscal room to maneuver. So our challenge now is how do we prioritize and create a framework and a roadmap to guide us between now and the end of the fiscal year so that we focus on both the highest priority items and the ones that have the biggest return for our community. So I'm going to very quickly walk you through a process that we're beginning to use, and we will come back with you in much greater depth and walk you through a similar process. So we began by looking at all of the priorities that we'd been assigned or that we were working on and that were in the queue. And we went through what's called weighted shortest job first prioritization process to look at each of those across 4 attributes, which I'll talk a little bit more about sooner. We then did a relative prioritization of those in terms of how much work they were and how much return on investment they were, and then developed a prototype city roadmap based on prioritizing those which had the highest return on investment and the most importance to our community. So in doing that work, we as a senior team are looking at 4 attributes. We're trying to understand what's the relative community value. What does this deliver to those in our community, our taxpayers, our customers, our citizens? Does this particular item enable other opportunities to take place or mitigate risk? Is there time criticality to this? Do we have to do this now, or could we wait next year and have the same outcome? And the job duration, which is really a way of saying how complex is this? Has this ever been done before? Is this something that we do every day and it's a snap of the fingers for us? Or does this require an act of Congress, which as we know is becoming even more difficult than an act of Congress? And so all of that comes together in something resembling a roadmap, which will look something like this. This is the blank version that you see here. Here you see the way that we internally organize a lot of our work, which is what we call the city manager's enterprise priorities. And these categories that are both outward-facing services and inward support are how we align a lot of our work at the highest level. We're going to come back to you in a future date with this filled out a bit, with a sense of what we think as a first cut are the priority projects, strategies, and policies that we need to focus on between now and the end of the fiscal year, and ask for your direction and guidance on that so that we can make sure we're saying yes to the right things and no to the right things as well. So again, all of that is sort of going into the hopper, but until we understand what it takes to deliver what used to be business as usual and now is very much business as unusual, our basic city services, we really don't know what resources we have to do many of the other priorities. So Kelly is going to take us now on a deeper dive into those services based on very fresh, up-to-the-minute data from each of our department heads and the teams working on those. So with that, I'll introduce Kelly and hand it over to her. Thank you, Kelly.
Great, thank you, Kip. I appreciate that introduction and setting the table for this. Mayor and council members, thank you for the opportunity to build on what we presented back in September. And before I do that, just want to sort of position this presentation within the space of Powered by People 2.0, which is still an emerging set of work, and just want to orient you here. As a reminder, the presentation in September, we started with this notion and have continued to focus on this in terms of safe workplace, both our employees and the public. And so positioning everything that we do within that context is first and foremost for us in terms of whether when we're considering the reopening or expansion of services. And then if you recall, we talked a little bit about 2 supporting initiatives to support our workforce in going paperless in many instances, but much more than that in the drive to digital space. And then how do we support effective teams, given that we have about 40% of our workforce working remotely, about 40% in the field, and about 20% in a city facility. And then just naming all the things around the circle that we need to consider as we move forward with anything under Powered by People 2.0. So in the next slide, essentially I shared with you last time, and actually in a presentation in August, about the 4 core objectives for Powered by People 2.0, which again is launched out of the EOC and with the longer term intent of informing priorities when these things get rolled back to the departments. But for today, similar to September, is again a follow-up and a focus on a safe workplace. Last time at a very high level with some very rough data, we laid out essentially 2 core things. One was to give a sense of the stages and alignment of what we were doing, both in terms of maintaining services or continuity of operations, adding various activities related to the EOC, and then some high level sense of what expansion or reopening looked like in stages 6 and 7. And we were just embarking on 7 at that point in time. So to set the table for you in terms of bringing you the next best data that we have, I just want to orient you to what we've collected, how we've collected, and what you're going to see in subsequent slides. So I think it's important to note that essentially what we did in a very short period of time with the support of our departments was we took the memo from March, which outlined from the city manager what we were continuing in terms of services. It was one that used language around essential and non-essential services. And that was generally framed around our budget structure. And then in May, as we were considering moving into stage 6 and wanted to hear from the departments, if you recall, I shared that we went and toured each department after they submitted those plans to figure out what they were thinking about and experiencing in terms of priorities for reopening. We collected some additional data, rather detailed and a slightly different structure. And so for this effort, we pared down the collection of information to a few things, but also the structure in terms of how you're going to see the lines of service. They could be service, they could be programs, they could be functions, and they have what I will term different grain sizes. Some are small and some are large. And in order to present to you a picture of both forest and trees, we've done a couple of interesting things to show you the big picture as well as give you some very detailed information. So we took the data collection and it came back, some of it as most recently as Monday and Tuesday. Again, grateful for the support of our directors who are super busy, and they delegated to key folks and key leaders who are equally busy. So I'm grateful to all of those out there who were responsive to our ask. And also, I couldn't have done this presentation without Eric Jensen and Keith Lewis, who worked their magic to show you what you have today. So we took that data, and in the bottom left corner is a legend, and put those services into 4 core buckets or categories. So continuity of operations, we'll show you in a minute. It's the first one up. Essentially is 100% so those were services that were at 100% in terms of service delivery at shelter in place, those things that we had to keep doing to serve our community and are still at 100%. We have a second category of services that weren't at 100% in terms of service delivery at shelter in place and are now there. We have in the yellow, you'll see a category of services that are continuing to expand and reopen. They are at something less than 100% at shelter in place and are still at something less than 100% in terms of delivery. And the fourth bucket, that sort of reddish colored one, are suspended services. They are actually very few and are most complex, and we'll share some of those details with you. There are 2 other pieces of information put here, again, to create the picture of the effort that is being asked of our departments. And so part of their effort for many of them, and we'll show you some data that shows which departments are most affected, are committed to the EOC and to our commitment to the community and standing up and maintaining an emergency operations center. And then mostly as a reminder, I'll say just a little bit about our vacancies. As a reminder, they kind of at times can ride under the surface. And when we're working with folks to talk about reopening expansion of services, this often comes up. And at the same time, it was a core part of our budget strategy and continues to be. So one more thing before we start to look at some data. So that's the trees. We're going to go into the weeds and show you some details. But at a forest level, we're going to show you some boxes so that overall you can gauge the relative size of effort for departments in each of those categories. So you'll see large boxes for some departments in each of those categories, and you'll see small boxes for some. We used staffing, and again, I have to emphasize these were approximations. This was not an accounting exercise for creating staffing, but a good gauge of the relative effort and a big citywide perspective on our services. So if we go to the next slide, this is the forest. So again, working from left to right, you'll see a much larger box of continuity of operations. I'll show you in a minute some detail around that, but you can gauge the relative size of effort for departments. So it's well known to us that fire and police are producing a lot of effort in the continuity of operations. And yet the other boxes, and we'll show you again the details, like airport, ESD, and public works are also making major contributions and have been since shelter in place. So since March, folks have been going full bore at making sure that the city is well served. The next bucket, a small one or a smaller category, is fully reopened. So we add to that another group of services that are at 100% but came on a little bit later. That affects public works, DOT, ESD, and Parks and Rec. And then we'll talk about those that are at less than 100%. You'll see a grouping or a category in yellow, as I mentioned, about reopening and expanding. And so we'll share some information about those. And then some distinct situations under the suspended category, in which I have some more information there. So let's start with continuity of operations. So here we've got about 110 services. That puts us at almost 50%, slightly under there, in terms of services that have been going since shelter in place, since March 17th. And you'll see police and fire, but we'll shift right now and show you some of the detail. We're gonna do this one slow because there's three slides that show the services by department that have been in that continuity of operations. And again, just as a reminder about the grain size of these and why we use staffing to gauge effort and show who is most impacted in terms of their human capital being deployed to city services. You'll see a bunch of lines for fire, a smaller number of lines for police, and yet they're both significant effort in terms of staffing. And yet there's still departments like the city clerk, like community energy, again with smaller quote levels of effort, but still going since continuity, or since shelter in place. And so including there, you know, ESD, making sure that garbage is picked up, that our recycling is done, that our water is safe, right? I'm really thrilled for their work. And so if we go to this next grouping of services in this continuity of operations, I'm really grateful for our finance folks being able to figure out how to pivot on a dime and go a lot of their services virtual. Some of them needed to be scaled down, but they made sure we were in paychecks. The city manager's office has played a special role, as many of you already know, in terms of just making sure government can work, but also making significant contributions to the EOC. Public Works, really, I spend a lot of time with some folks from Public Works, so I might be a little partial in terms of what they are faced in making sure that our infrastructure, and by the way, that our folks are in PPE, and we've got signage and floor markings. So you'll see that there. Also another strategic support unit, IT, I want to make a little shout out to them. In addition to making sure everything is stayed on track, that we were able to pivot overnight to 40% of our workforce going remote and sorting out all the challenges that posed. They put the gas pedal on business process automation. That is serving us well. I can testify to that directly in the city. And our last slide here with continuity of operations. Again, we'll see more about what these other departments are doing in terms of library and Parks and Rec. But you can see that even keeping the park rangers out there and mobile, making sure that they're safe and vehicles and being able to protect and survey our parks has been an important thing for continuity of services. I won't bore you with the continuity of services for human resources, but I can testify to what we've been doing since shelter in place there as well. So we're going to go to the next grouping of services, and these are ones that are fully reopened now, but we're not at shelter in place. And so that adds another 64 services here for a total of 174 of the 240, whatever, almost 40, 40, I can't remember the total. And so if you go to the next page, the next slide. Awesome. So here, there's a variety of situations. So for example, if you go to Department of Transportation, you know, our sewers are in good hands. Our paving has continued like nobody's business. You'll see all of the things in Parks and Rec in terms of making sure that the administrative part of that is actually working and supporting all the efforts that are going on. And things like the golf course services are going, and that produces revenue for the city. Again, you'll see all of the things that are going on in Public Works, again, in different grain sizes. They've broken out here some detail about what they were able to bring back at 100%. I think there are some things here just to note. You know, early on, there were some things we were trying to decipher from the county order that might have prevented us from doing some things. We had to figure out whether or not we could do certain things safely. And as we were also ramping up the EOC, there were staffing implications for many of these areas to make sure that we could bring these services up to 100%. So, so those are the two big ones to emphasize in terms of services, programs, and functions that are 100%. So let's move to the reopening and expansion of services. This is the folks in yellow. They're not quite at 100% and are working at it. And if we go to the next slide, so that's an additional 56, which gets us to 230. What I will note here is that most of them in this grouping of 56, 40 of the 56 that you'll see to your far left are ones that are nearing 100%. So they're somewhere between 75 and 99% in terms of their service level. And so they all have different circumstances. If I think about housing, I think about Parks and Rec, I think about the library in particular. Those folks have been deeply committed both on the ground in terms of support and leadership in the EOC, and are now able to turn their attention and consider how to get these toward 100%, considering staffing and a variety of other things. But each one is in a different set of circumstances in terms of why it's not at 100%. And then we have a small number, 9 and 7, who are in the 75 to 50% operational and 50 to 25% operational. Again, all in different situations. For example, a few weeks ago, early September, I want to say, we had a long, extensive conversation about bringing back attorneys into the 15th and 16th floor in order to support work related to jury trials that could not be done at home. So it brought a bunch of folks back. We had a long conversation about how to do that safely. So just to give you a sense, they're not at full capacity in terms of their service, but they're also dependent on what happens also at the courts in the county. So just to cast that picture, that's those services that are not fully back yet. And then the group of services that are suspended, there's about 21 here. Again, they range in size and complexity, but I will say for 3 really important areas, 2 of which I'll mostly speak to. Parks and Rec and library are 2 areas where it takes us into the public realm and public safety. So that's first and foremost to keep in mind. And having spent some time with the safety and facilities teams, it's not inconsequential to try to figure out where you put plexiglass, where you put touchless devices, how you do a ticketing system, how you queue people up, how you keep people corralled, how you make sure social distancing. And so I think those are things that we all care about deeply in terms of wanting to enjoy those things in our community. And at the same time, we are deeply committed to making sure in this new space of larger public events that we can do that safely. I will offer up that we have been working for a few weeks now on the facilities and safety part of Happy Hollow Zoo. We are very close to being able to, and I'll let John, if he needs to, speak to that later, but sometime very soon being able to start and ramp up a reopening of Happy Hollow Zoo. The library at the moment has half a dozen proposals into our safety and facilities team, and we've briefed the executive EOC team about them. And we have a large meeting on Friday to consider all of those, understand the big picture. And the challenge there is not operating a service out in the open, but in essence, bringing people into a space. And so how do we, again, make sure that we are doing what we need to do from a safety perspective to support that? And we're definitely supportive of that. The safety and facilities team are working hard on having that conversation with them to support them to do that. The others, again, are in different situations, and we certainly can speak to those more with questions. 2 more areas I want to speak to here. I think it's important, as Kip mentioned earlier, there's about 13 brand new things that we've been doing, things we had not previously considered and are learning our way and continue to learn our way through them out of the EOC. And if you go to the next page, I think what's instructive here, at least for me and perhaps others, is that while this is about 400 people in the EOC, if you were to go back in time to May, June, early July, our EOC was at 650 plus. So we've come down in some numbers, pared it down, been judicious, are having ongoing conversations about making sure we have the right people with the right commitment in the EOC, and that'll all come back as part of the prioritization conversation. But I want to point you here to the 107 folks that are in the EOC. About a third of the EOC are leadership folks that the departments don't have to draw on a regular basis. Now, we all know, those of us who are in the leadership positions in the EOC are also constantly going back to our departments and playing some role there, but you're not fully committed. And for some of the things that we want to expand and keep or get to 100%, or the complicated ones that we want to make sure that we can offer safely, that leadership is important. And yet our commitment to the EOC and to making sure that we can function in an emergency situation well and effectively is certainly a big commitment for us, and one that we're all acknowledging. So you can also then see The dark lines across the departments back there, just one more, Andrew, sorry, I jumped the gun on you. Just give you a sense by department. So again, PRNS is heavily leveraged in the EOC, both from a support staff and some leadership. Public Works leadership is heavily leveraged in the EOC. DOT has a lot of support folks helping out, and the CMO obviously is in there in terms of leadership. So it gives you a sense of who's impacted by the EOC. The last point of mention here is our vacancies. And I, about 3.5 years ago, came into the city manager's office just after there had been a lot of activity, a lot of conversation, and a lot of consternation about our vacancies here in the city. If y'all recall, Civic Innovation helped to re-engineer the hiring process. And I would say in March of this last year, as we were looking at numbers and before shelter in place and COVID hit, we were ready to get into the single digits in terms of vacancy rates. And so 679 right now is us holding steady since March at about 11% vacancy rate. Our goal was to get into the single digits. So I want to say, number one, that we clearly utilized a hiring freeze process at the very, very early stages of shelter in place to make sure that we had a budget strategy that was going to keep us as whole as possible, and clearly a smart strategy to help us weather other agencies have not fared as well. And so it didn't go radically worse in terms of vacancies because there's a really thorough and well sort of oiled machine in terms of undoing the hiring freeze for key positions, and yet trying to maintain that balance of making sure we're fiscally prudent and still in good place for next year, while at the same time making sure we can support the departments. So I was heartened when we looked at these numbers that they haven't gone radically south. And yet it is important to acknowledge that there are some areas, so if you go to the next slide, Andrew, that there are some departments that are disproportionately affected by vacancies. And so you can see DOT, ESD, PRNS, Public Works, and PBCE, as well as to some degree, fire and police. But also, if you look closely at some smaller departments like finance and IT, who are key strategic support units who support all of our city services, they have some pretty high vacancies of their own in order to support the city. So I just offer that up as context and something to file away in the back of our minds as we think about how do we do all of this work as you all make some decisions and consider with the city manager and other leaders about making and deciding priorities. And so with that, a couple of parting words on the next slide. So first and foremost, I'm starting to feel like a broken record, I feel, and I can't emphasize enough, when you talk to people on the ground, making them and ensuring for them that they are safe. They have to feel safe for them to function in their jobs well and to also serve our community well. So we're super concerned and still committed to that. A reminder along with the vacancies is that we have budget constraints. And so while no city service was eliminated outright, departments did experience resource constraints and are experiencing them from budget reductions. So that was not as painless as one might think from the outside. And so they're dealing with that as well. It is very clear to me, spending the last 6 months or so in this work, that it's complex and it's harder to do what I would say is not business as usual anymore. We know this work best, so that's a good thing, and yet it's more complex and it's more difficult for sure. On top of that, again, the new work in terms of the EOC response, which has been incredibly important to our city, and we've never done it before, has tapped our human capital in significant ways. And then as we have continued to support the EOC efforts, departments have fewer people because of our commitments there. So with that, I think I'm turning this over to you, Kip. Is that correct?
That's right. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you for that deep and data-rich dive into our city service delivery during COVID. We'd like to close this COVID-19 update by highlighting an amazing partner in our COVID response. This week, we are privileged to get a first look at an art project called Holding the Moment, which has enlisted San Jose artists to create real-time San Jose art to fit this moment in our city's history. For me, and I think for many of us, art is a way that we feel when it feels overwhelming, a way that we express the inexpressible. And as I viewed the artwork that you're about to see, what struck me is how art can help us comprehend this incomprehensible moment. I want to introduce the amazing creative leaders behind making this project, taking it from conception to completion. Our own Carrie Adams-Hapner and Mary Rubin from our Office of Economic Development, and who will talk us through and share with you this amazing and moving art. Carrie and Mary, it's all you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Kip, for that introduction. I am Carrie Adams-Hapner. I'm the Director of the Office of Cultural Affairs. Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. It is really an honor to be with you today to talk about this exciting new public art project, which will be installed at the San Jose Airport, called Holding the Moment. And by way of background, the city has a percent for art ordinance in which 1% of eligible capital improvement project costs are set aside for public art. And that includes airport capital projects. And a decade ago, the city received national acclaim for its art and technology public art program, in which we commissioned iconic projects like The Hands, Space Observer, and eCloud. And this year, when additional public art revenues were generated by capital projects at the airport, we chose to take a new approach. One that was rooted in economic development, much like the famous WPA projects, focused on getting our local creatives and artists back to work during this pandemic. So our project budget is $265,000, of which $240,000 is directly invested in our local artist community. The inspiration for this project started in March, shortly after the shelter-in-place order, and we knew our arts community felt the financial impact in lost income and jobs. And this compelled us to develop a project to support our local artists, all of which are either living or have a studio in San Jose. Our top level goal with Holding the Moment is to recognize the value of our artists and what they contribute to our community. And certainly this includes financial impact, but also valuing artists' perspectives, their way of framing the world. And of course, public art is the community's art and involves extensive public involvement and partnerships, which we will share today. So I want to thank the Director of Public Art, Michael Ogilvie, and Senior Public Art Project Manager, Mary Rubin, who I'm excited to introduce and who will walk you through this project and share the incredible body of powerful work created by our artists that really speak to this moment. And each artwork is incredible, which you'll see, but it is their totality as a body of work that really tells this compelling narrative about the human condition in San Jose over the past 7 months. And Mary Rubin is a leader in the field of public art, and she has been with the city for over 20 years. And she has been the public art project manager at the airport and the thought leader behind iconic projects like Idea Tree at the convention center, all the projects at the airport, but also really important community-based projects like the Literature Project that engaged our local youth to develop poetry for over 500 litter cans placed across the city. So with that, it is my honor to introduce to you Mary Rubin. Mary, please take it away. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Carrie. I am so excited to be here today. And in the next 5 minutes, I am going to share, as Carrie said, this inspiring body of 96 artworks with you that will be exhibited at the San Jose Airport in the Terminal B showcases. Hopefully most of you, if back to the original slide, most of you are familiar with the site. And while the images are playing, as they've started to, I'll walk you through the project. So in April, we started brainstorming the development of this project to recognize and value artists in our community and to amplify their voices. Holding the Moment initiative was launched in July when we issued a call for submissions inviting San Jose artists to submit 2-dimensional artworks that comment or reflect on this unusual time of living in the midst of a pandemic. Our actual description was broad and open for interpretation. Each of the artworks would be awarded $2,500. Each of the selected artworks would be awarded $2,500, and artists were given the opportunity to submit 3 artworks for consideration with a maximum of 2 awards possible per artist. With each submittal, we also asked for a conceptual narrative to provide further context and insight into the artwork and the artist's perspectives, of course. So to reach as many artists as possible in the community, we did extensive outreach, including partnering with local arts organizations, basically just, tried to get the word out as far and deep as possible. When the call closed in mid-August, we had received 327 submissions by 143 eligible artists. Going into the selection, we knew we had space for 96 artworks. Thus, you might imagine, it was a pretty competitive process. The artworks were juried by a diverse group of prominent Bay Area arts professionals who deeply considered the integrity of both the artwork and the narratives together. And after a 5-hour virtual meeting, the selection panel recommended the maximum number of artworks, 96, by 77 artists. The Public Art Committee approved the collection on October 6th. And again, each of these submissions received $2,500. Working with exhibit designer Cynthia Cow, who is also from San Jose, the artworks have been grouped into 6 groups of 16 artworks. The images of the artworks are currently being printed at 24 by 36. They're fine art display boards, basically. And each group will be displayed for 5 weeks from November 1st through the end of May. They will also be shared on our website with the narratives. So at the airports, the narratives are not there, but there's a QR code that will link you to the narratives. But on the website, you'll be able to have access to the narratives, and they'll be shared across the city and the airport social media platforms and have their own hashtag, Holding the Moment San Jose. Again, you'll see the narratives. So I guess what I can say from working with the pieces, that the artists come from diverse backgrounds, and their point of view, which you can see here, are just so vast and varied. As Carrie said, each artwork tells its own story. And I mean, they're only flashing up here for, 3 seconds, but each has their own story, and they range from amusing and sweet to poignant, and some of them are very profound and touching. And as a collection, I'd say that the body of work tells a pretty impressive, wide, and diverse story of our community. And I've spoken to many of these artists in the process of putting this together, and they are pretty excited for the opportunity to show their work, but also, for us to get to know them through the work and through the narratives. And it's just been an exciting project to work on. And I'll say, in terms of city staff, I mean, you might imagine, of course, there's a vast number of people that work on these projects, but just to process 77 checks for the artists, that's been a contribution. I just want to really shout out to everybody that has helped get the word out, that supported this project in so many ways. It's been a labor of love and pretty exciting. And I think, these slides are arranged alphabetically. So we're kind of coming towards the end.
I think what's really incredible about this project is just the diversity of the artists, whether it is ethnic diversity, age diversity. They're all different stages of their careers. Some of them emerging artists, but some are lifelong learners. Like we have former council member Margie Matthews in here, who was selected. So it's really, really powerful just to see everybody that's participated.
Yeah, and Kip, do you want me to take this, or do you want to
Go ahead.
You said that, so every week, I guess, or every briefing, you have kind of significant partners or contributors, and I think we just want to highlight, again, it's not staff selecting the artists. There was a very considered selection panel that included Cece Carpio, who is a Bay Area artist who is also a storyteller, Vicki Day from the airport, the passenger experience manager, who's incredibly considered, Rory Patakin, who is a curator at San Jose Museum of Art, Mariela Perez, who's with MACLA, Amanda Rawson, who is a public art administrator with Art Builds Community, which is local to San Jose, and Stuart Robson, who is a Bay Area artist who taught at Stanford for a while and is now at the Headlands. And also, so critical to the support of this project has been Cynthia Cow, who works with different art organizations in the city, but she has been instrumental support in the exhibit design, which in and of itself is just ingenious and elegant. And I hope you all get a chance to see it. Okay, Kip.
Thank you. And I just want to say thank you, Mary. And, you know, these are our partners, and just underscores that public art is your art, it's the community's art. So thank you very much. And please give a virtual round of applause to our local artists. Art is your art, it's the community's art. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Carrie. And most of all, thanks to the artists who are helping to express and feel and make real this ineffable moment. You'll see some of these coming back. We'll be using these in future presentations with credit to the artists in some of our future presentations, not all 96, except for this time, but we really wanted to give you the sense of the full body of work and the full feel of what our artist community is helping us express. So with that, we conclude this item 3.1 and turn it back to you, Dave, for any concluding remarks that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Kip. Thanks to the entire team, and Mayor, we are available for questions.